mechanical engineer by training, and hopefully we'll be getting back into vehicles very soon. I've done some in this area, and it's sort of vehicles are sort of my area of main interest, and so I was asked to come here today, sort of share some of that with you. I guess I want to ask you guys, why am I even here to talk about this? Why do we care about how much we drive or what we drive or what we move ourselves around in? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, we're kind of like running out of oil, and we're polluting the air with the oil that we use.
There you go. We got two right there. So we'll say oil and resource use and pollution, two huge ones. Anything else? Yeah.
Global warming.
Global warming, which just shortened with GW. And that, of course, we're just gonna separate out from pollution, but it is another form of pollution. Anything else?
More efficient ways to use different energy sources.
All right, so let's do energy efficiency. Anything else? These are all pretty good. Yes?
Lifestyle issues, commuting,
Well, that's what I'm here to talk about too. Oh, sprawl, there we go. That's a good one.
use.
Sprawl, land use. Which overlaps a little bit with resource use, just one type of resource, but yeah.
Disjointed sense of community.
Whoa, there we go. All right, so we'll talk about community and the human condition. Yes?
And like public transportation?
Transit. And that, of course, comes back to our energy efficiency as well as pollution and energy use, etc. Pretty good list. I think that's pretty much covers everything. But there's actually a lot of reasons why I'm here. Vehicles can contribute to all these things. So in order to understand what we can do to improve our current situation, it's helpful to understand where we are now and how our current vehicles actually operate. Luckily there's writing. This is not my diagram. I actually pulled it very quickly off the internet. It shows the 4 stages in a 4-stroke combustion engine. This diagram may make it look very simple, but there's a lot of complicated chemistry and mechanics and stuff going on inside here. We're just going to sort of use this as a starting off point. So in the first step, if you imagine a piston in a car, it looks sort of like the top of a soup can almost. And in this picture, that's the sort of cylindrical object. And that is connected with a rod to the crankshaft at the bottom. And so the piston moves up and down. And at the bottom, you'll see the crankshaft then, that motion is translated into a circular motion, which is then sent through a transmission to your wheels. So how does the piston actually move up and down? First, we have up at the top, there's an intake port and an exhaust port, and these let air in and exhaust out. So the first stage, the piston moves downwards, the intake valve is open, brings in the air and fuel mixture. Then when it hits the bottom, the piston goes back up, the valves are closed at the top, so now you have a closed chamber, and that fuel and air gets compressed together. But near the top, a spark is fired, causing this fuel and air to combust, and that forces the piston back downwards. And then in the final one, the piston at the bottom then pushes the exhaust gases out of the open exhaust port. And then this process repeats itself over and over again. One of the most important things for us to take away from it is this is really a contained explosion. 20% of the energy that's in your fuel actually gets translated into rotational motion. So 80% of what you paid for, what was piped from Alaska or shipped from Saudi Arabia or wherever, just gets wasted as heat. This wouldn't be maybe all so bad if there was no exhaust stage. You know, if you could burn everything and then, nothing happened, that would be great. Well, unfortunately, you can't destroy matter like that. So you have some things left over. Gasoline, which is gasoline, even diesel fuel, all of our fuels are hydrocarbons. So they have carbon and hydrogen, and that's in varying degrees based on the fuel. And then we burn that in air, and that makes some water and CO2. So that whole combustion process, remember I said there's a whole area of research? Well, what they try to do is adjust the flame temperature and the flame shape and all sorts of things to try to make the combustion as complete as possible, which is this. When it's not complete, well, all the carbon, which comes from the fuel, doesn't quite make it to carbon dioxide. So you get carbon monoxide. Unfortunately, not all the fuel is burned. So we have some unburned hydrocarbons, which is going to label as HC. So there's one other thing. We're burning this fuel in air? Well, air is not just oxygen. It's about 78% nitrogen. Nitrogen is an inert gas. It doesn't like to react with different things. However, at high temperatures, it will react. So it decides, yeah, I'm going to react with oxygen, and then we make NO and NO2. And these also contribute to smog, NOx, and hydrocarbons together. In diesel fuel, there's also sulfur. Gasoline doesn't have sulfur in it, but diesel fuel does. And so that also reacts with the oxygen, and we get oxides of sulfur, or SOx. There's a lot of things that this process is spitting into the environment, like I said, thousands of times a minute. Every time you have this explosion in your engine, those are the things you're making. Now can anybody think of what sort of driving conditions might affect how much of these pollutants you make? Yeah, the weight. Very good. If you've ever been driving down the road on the highway, see a tractor trailer cruising along, you probably smell it, but you may not see any of the exhaust coming out. But once you hit a hill and that thing's chugging up a hill on the highway, you'll see huge black plumes of smoke coming out. And mostly that's the hydrocarbons, but that's a very good example of the increased load of taking that huge mass and now trying to move it up a hill as well as down the highway is causing this reaction to make a lot more pollution because you're just putting that much more stress on your combustion process. And finally, one other thing is if you accelerate quickly, it reduces the amount of time that this reaction can actually happen and has sort of the same effect. So there are a few things. The cars these days have pretty complicated computer systems. Maybe 10 or 15 years ago, a car, you wouldn't need to take it to the dealer, let's say. You could maybe have a friend work on various parts of the vehicle. Today, there's a lot of things where you have to plug it into a computer. And the reason is that the computer is figuring out, taking all of these calculations inside the engine and trying to figure out the most efficient way, monitoring the temperature and trying to adjust that, adjusting when that spark actually fires, all sorts of things, and to try to reduce the emissions as well as make it as efficient as possible. Of course, 20% is pretty much the limit on that. But in terms of overall pollution reduction, the single most important advancement was the advent of the catalytic converter. If any of you have had the unfortunate experience of having to replace this component on your vehicle, you know it's very expensive. So once all these exhaust gases leave your engine, they then get piped down your exhaust pipe. But it doesn't just go right out into the air anymore. We now have the first item that exhaust hits is catalytic converter. And it's basically a tube in your exhaust pipe, which is a very fine honeycomb of a very expensive metal. Platinum and rhodium are actually the metals used. So if you've ever looked at the price of anything that's platinum, it's not cheap. So why these metals? Well, the catalytic converter, and what it does is it catalyzes the conversion of those three substances. So a catalyst basically helps facilitate a reaction. And what this does is when it's nice and hot, it takes the unburned hydrocarbons, combines those with oxygen, and makes CO2 and water. And then it actually takes the carbon monoxide, combines it with oxygen, and makes carbon dioxide. And finally, it takes the oxides of nitrogen, combines that with oxygen, and makes nitrogen and oxygen. So now you're left with water, more CO2, air, and nitrogen. You can probably imagine how excited the auto industry was when they figured this out, and they had these, the Clean Air Act came along, had these very stringent requirements for auto emissions. And instead of really changing the combustion, they decided let's just throw a Band-Aid on it, and this was quite an amazing device. Now there's still a few problems with this. One, when your car is cold, none of this actually happens. The other problem is this reaction, of course, they don't all go to completion because that's in an ideal world. So we still do have some hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen oxides. And finally, we still have carbon dioxide. So we're still dealing with, we may have cut down a lot on our sort of local air pollution, but we still have to deal with the greenhouse gas. So when you go to an emission test, these are the three things that they are testing your car for. they'll put your car on what's called a dynamometer. A person sits in your car, watches the computer screen, and matches your road speed, and you pretty much accelerate to 35 and back down. And they do this a couple times to try to get an overall picture. So if on the off chance that your car performed really well on one test, there's 2 others to sort of average it out, or vice versa. Now, the last pollutant that we haven't talked too much about is CO2. And as you mentioned, it's a greenhouse gas. That is not in dispute. Also not in dispute, the majority of climate scientists are all in agreement that our production, the human race's production of greenhouse gases, is the culprit for what is causing the warming of the climate. If we look at this equation, the only place the carbon from this carbon dioxide comes from is your hydrocarbon fuel. So if you use more fuel, you're going to create more carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide production in a vehicle is directly related to the gas mileage a vehicle gets. So if your vehicle gets 40 miles to the gallon, you'll make half the pollution, global warming pollution on the same trip as a car that gets 20 miles per gallon. What kind of factors can you see that would affect the gas mileage? Yeah.
Size of the car?
Size. Yes, there was a hand behind him too.
Yeah, like your tire pressures.
Tire pressure.
The transmission.
Transmission. Anything else?
The way you drive.
Yep. So we're going to just call that habits. I'll expand on that a little bit. Yep.
Whether or not you drive with your air conditioning.
Loads. Often called accessory loads. So your air conditioning, or your windows open, or if you have your rear defrost and your headlights on, I'll say all your electrical loads. Yeah.
How fast you're driving?
Speed. I'm going to put that up here as just maintenance. Yeah.
I was gonna say like a turbocharger.
All right. I'm going to put that under engine type. Speed, I'm also going to put in acceleration. Oh, yeah.
That's what I was just
Oh,
going to say.
acceleration. Sorry.
Yeah.
And terrain? I don't know.
Terrain? All right, yep. One other thing is the shape of the vehicle. A big boxy SUV is less aerodynamic than, say, a Honda Insight. So I think that's a pretty good list. So the size of your vehicle, the heavier it is, as we talked about, the more energy it takes to move it from place to place, especially when you're going up a hill. Your tire pressure is very important because this is the friction between your tires and the road. If your tires are low, there's more rubber. The tire sort of squats down a little bit, and that's why you can see it sort of peeking out on the side. That causes there's more contact between your rubber and the asphalt, and so that you're basically burning more fuel just so that additional rubber can go down the road. Now, you want to be careful. You don't want to pump your tires up too much because, there's a certain rating on the tire, as Teresa mentioned. If you go over that rating, one, the tire may not be able to take that pressure. And we're talking, no service station would do this. But in mileage contests, for example, people really pump their tires up. You could potentially, the tire could give out. And also, you may suffer, the higher pressure you get. If you get too high, then you have less rubber on the road than is spec'd out for that tire and for that vehicle. Somebody mentioned the transmission. These days there are 2 types of your conventional transmissions, the automatic transmission and standard transmission. Both of them are required because a gasoline engine only has a pretty small range of RPMs where it's actually can provide where it's most efficient, and it also cannot provide enough power in the low RPMs to actually get the car moving. If you've ever tried to learn how to drive a standard vehicle and you let that clutch up too soon with the engine RPMs too low, the car just stalls because the engine can't provide enough power to get the car moving. And so we need a transmission to have a set of gears that we can run the engine at its best revolutions. Now, years ago, the automatic transmissions their final gear, I think, did not have what's called a direct drive, I believe is the term. And so they were much less efficient on the highway than a standard vehicle, because a standard vehicle, just in the way it's constructed, you could get, you're losing less energy just in the transmission, all other things being same in the car. These days, automatics are still slightly less efficient, but much better than they used to be. The loads, somebody had also mentioned about, if you use your air conditioning or if you have your windows open, that's actually a fairly large load. If you've plugged an air conditioner in your house and the lights dim every time that compressor kicks on, that sort of gives you a feel for how much energy it takes to cool the air. As I had mentioned, the efficiency of the gas engine is only about 20%. So we have a huge excess of heat. That's basically, we're just trying to expel anywhere we can. There's a radiator in front of the car. Pretty much every car has a grill right in front. And that air is forced through the grill to try to cool down the engine coolant, which is running through the engine and through this radiator, and keep the engine at its operating temperature. But if we siphon some of that off into the car, we can then use that to heat the car and make it nice and toasty. And so except when you just start out and your car, the engine's cold, so can't make any heat to heat the inside. Heat is basically free, if you will. If you don't turn it on, it doesn't take any more energy, exactly. Somebody had mentioned a turbocharger. And a turbocharger these are components that can boost the pressure inside your engine. And that way, ideally, usually the idea is to get more power out of it so you can accelerate faster. How a turbocharger is powered is it takes this hot exhaust stream of gases that are getting forced out, puts a little propeller on it basically, and uses that to then compress the air coming in. So you're using some of that wasted energy that's getting shot out your tailpipe. Your habits and maintenance, you want to keep your car basically as up to snuff as possible. Keep your tires maintained. You want to have clean air filter, oil changes. The oil change will make sure the piston can move up and down as freely as possible. Over time, a lot of gunk gets built up, and that can reduce the efficiency of the engine. So the average vehicle is about 4,000 pounds, and we're talking just car. So Honda Accord might be 3,200 or so, but that's a lot of weight. I think it's Amory Levins who's credited with saying that 1% of the energy that's in your fuel actually moves you down the road in a car. And so how does he get that rough number? Well, the engine's 20% efficient, so 80% is gone. But then if you're, say, a 200-pound person in a 4,000-pound car, you're only 5% of the weight that's getting moved down the road. So 5% of 20% is 1%. So what can we do? How can we drop the weight of the vehicles? Well, today there are more advanced materials that are actually stronger and perform better in crash situations than steel. Of course, they're more expensive, but they're significantly lighter and can add a lot to our fuel savings. You hear a lot of talk, lighter vehicles are less safe. Not true. It depends how it's designed. A lot of cars will use aluminum, at least in aluminum in the engine because that's lighter than steel. But for body components, aluminum frames are pretty popular and sort of in lightweight vehicles. But even more so in terms of advanced materials, advanced carbon composites, which are pretty advanced stuff, very expensive. Also to do with the load, we can make the shapes much more aerodynamic. The most aerodynamic shape is, does anybody know?
Water drop.
Exactly, a water drop or raindrop. So if you have curved in the front and tapered towards the back. And this lets you separate the air in the beginning and let it rejoin in the back and sort of minimizes the amount of energy that gets wasted as the air goes that route.
Spoiler?
Spoiler, thank you. I was blanking on the word. What the spoiler does is it actually forces the rear of the car, shapes the air such that the rear car gets forced down to the ground. But on your average, my car actually has one built in, which is kind of funny, but a very small one. But you'll see a lot of cars, all the hybrids have them, not for that purpose, but for the purpose of trying to reduce the drag as the air comes around the vehicle. What the spoiler tries to do, as the air comes around the car, if you can kick it up a little and cause it to curl faster around the back, because as you move the car, there's nothing, so that air has to rush in to that vacuum. It's that movement of air that's dragging your car backwards and your car's fighting against it. So if you can get the air to do that quicker, then that'll reduce that drag at the back of your car. And finally, your engine really would be most efficient if it could just run at its most efficient speed all the time. So what can we do to take what we have with the internal combustion engine and try to chop out some of those least efficient parts? And that's where hybrid vehicles come into play. What a hybrid can do is it adds an electric motor and a small battery to a vehicle to try to get rid of some of the least efficient sections of the internal combustion cycle. With an electric motor, you can actually reduce the size of the gasoline engine a little bit. The engine size doesn't have to be as big as if it were the only power source in the vehicle. Now there are a few ways to set up a hybrid, and yeah.
I'm just wondering where the electric motor gets its electricity from.
That's good. In a parallel setup, you have your gas engine and your electric motor. One can drive the wheels, another one can drive the wheels, or they both can drive in parallel. Whereas in a series arrangement, you have a gas engine, or I should say fossil fuel engine, because it could be something other than gasoline, powering a generator, which makes electricity, and then that gets stored in a battery and gets used in a motor. You actually can have the size of your constant average demand on the vehicle is lower than the maximum demand. So you have sort of a battery to buffer that. So when you need a boost of power, you can draw that off the battery and make the battery charge can go a little lower. But this generator is constantly charging the battery. So we have parallel and series. Unfortunately, all the hybrids on the market use neither of those. They use various combinations at different times. And so that just makes my job more difficult. And there's really three different ones currently. There's a mild hybrid, a light hybrid, and a full hybrid. And those terms are not, exclusively used. Various people will call this that, and that's just my sort of terminology for it. I didn't come up with them, but used them, picked them from here and there. So we'll start with the middle one, the light hybrid. The Honda hybrids, all of these hybrids are pretty much gasoline vehicles, but in between your engine and your transmission, there is a very thin electric motor. And what that does is it provides a boost when you're accelerating. If you apply electricity to a motor, it spins. If you spin a motor, it becomes a generator and creates electricity. So it's one way you can get motion, or if you have motion, it creates electricity. So in your car, in these hybrids, when you use the electric motor to boost your acceleration, but then if you're braking or slowing down, that motor can then turn into a generator, recapture some of that rotational motion, generate electricity, and store that electricity in the battery. Another nice feature of these light hybrids is when you come to a stoplight, normally in your car, the engine's idling, you're getting 0 miles per gallon. Hybrids shut the engine off completely at traffic lights. But this is different because you don't actually even notice. You notice that your car is silent. The instant you put your foot on the gas pedal or shift into gear, the motor kicks that engine back on and you keep going. So you save all that idling, inefficiencies in the idling. But in reality, the Honda hybrids are light because the gas engine has to be on all the time. We'll see some vehicles from General Motors in particular. They use a mild hybrid setup. Now normally in your car you have a 12-volt battery strapped to the engine. There's what's called an alternator, and that's really just a small generator which has a belt, runs as the engine turns, drives down the road. That generator turns and keeps that 12-volt battery nice and charged up. So in these mild hybrids, they use a beefed up alternator to charge the slightly larger battery. And really, all that gives you is this alternator can also add power back to the engine. So it provides this idle off feature at traffic lights. So you do get fuel savings. You're not wasting fuel as you're sitting in traffic. And like the light hybrids, when you want to go, it starts the engine right back up. So they're really achieving the same goal. The difference is that it can provide a lot more power. I know in the light and full hybrid, the power that these motors can apply is much greater than the power of your tiny little 12-volt starter motor. So those are barely hybrids, but they should be mentioned because they have hybrid in the name when they sell them. So, and that's where the slight percentage increase in fuel economy comes from. Finally is the full hybrid, which is the Toyota Sisso, Toyota Prius, the Camry, the Highlander. Maybe they'll have the Sienna coming out. And then they have a bunch of Lexus ones. And their setup is sort of, sometimes it's a parallel setup, sometimes it's a series setup. It's very complicated. The Toyotas differ from the light hybrids because they can run under electric power only. When you start up, the electric motor starts up the car. At a certain point, the amount of power you want out of that drive system can't fully be supplied by the electric motor. So then the gas engine kicks on, and they both supply power to the wheels in a parallel mode. And then as you drive down the road, the computer figures out the best way to match all these different things and Sometimes you'll be driving solely on electric power if you're just kind of, cruising along at 40 miles an hour. If you're coasting to a stop, the electric motor turns into a generator, generates electricity, charging your battery. At other times, the gas engine will be powering the wheels and powering a generator to charge the battery. So it's a pretty complicated combination of setups. But in the end, you have your idle off stoplights. You get rid of a lot of the acceleration load on the engine because the electric motor can do that. You also get, you also have regenerative braking, which is what it's called when you brake and the motor acts as a generator. But at the center of it is what's called a continuously variable transmission. Remember before we had talked about you want this gas engine to run at one speed, run at its most efficient speed, and that's when it'll produce the least amount of pollution and provide its highest efficiency. Well, that's what a continuously variable transmission actually does for you. In a normal car, you shift through the gears, and the engine has to, climb in its RPMs and then start back over at the bottom and climb. Just like if you're, pedaling your 10-speed bike. And you have your starting your lowest gear, and then that's pretty easy, you get going, but then you can't really go as fast as you want anymore, so you shift gears. Well, imagine if you could just pedal constantly and the gears on your bike knew how to change their ratio such that the back wheel just kept going faster and faster and faster, and you just sort of pedaled along and the gear ratio changed incrementally. Instead of just 10 steps, or in your car 5 steps or 4 steps, you had almost an infinite number of gears. In a nutshell, it's a pretty complex mechanical device, but that's what a continuously variable transmission does. Is it has an infinite set of gear ratios that lets your engine run at a constant speed, or a few constant speeds, based on if you need to kick out more power, well, it'll jump to one of its, its high efficient speed, whereas if you're cruising, it'll be at its low speed, which is still efficient. And there's no reason why every automatic transmission vehicle today couldn't have one of these in its place. And you would get, depending on the setup, you may realize, just 10% fuel efficiency gain just from that. Yeah, question?
Do you have the full hybrids, do you have to plug them in, or do they just generate their own electricity?
You guys are great. You're constantly getting ahead of me. That's good.
Sorry.
Currently, you do not plug them in. And Toyota used to make a big stink about this. Never needs to be plugged in, because heaven forbid we plug everything else in. Why not your car too? But they wanted to, they felt that it was very important that people realize you just fill it up like a regular car, no strings attached. But there's at least a lot of talk about what are called plug-in hybrid vehicles. And that's sort of a next step. Yeah?
How much energy is lost in electric cars?
How much is lost, you said? I'll talk about that in more detail, but to give you just a rough sort of teaser, an electric motor is about 90 to 95% efficient, if not more. So 95% of the electrical energy that's sent to it gets translated into rotational motion. And remember, a gas engine is about 20. So right there, from your power source to your wheels, incredibly more efficient internal combustion engine. And then you have to look at, well, where did that electricity come from in the first place? So I'll talk about that in more detail, but it's an excellent question. So this, very briefly, is just an example of what you would get at an emissions testing station. It's kind of hard to read, but basically, the top thing is the speed. The guy drove up to 30 miles an hour, 30, 35 roughly. As we talked about, hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, NOx. Interestingly enough, it does measure your carbon dioxide, although there's no regulation. And then it measures the oxygen coming out of your exhaust. The first line in every graph says 1x limit, so that's 1 times the limit. So there's actually 2 lines, which makes it a little more confusing. One of which is the grams per mile, and the other is the parts per million. And those are basically just different ways of measuring how much pollution is coming out. So in these, you can see, hey, this is 1.2 grams per mile, which doesn't sound like much, but then 12,000 miles, that's a lot of grams. Hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, under the limit. Of course, these limits are different for the type of vehicle you have, the year it was made, the type of engine it has. So just because one car passes and another doesn't, doesn't mean the car that passed is actually cleaner. Light trucks have much less stringent requirements for a given year than a passenger vehicle. A light truck, of course, is minivan, pickup truck, or SUV. But here you can see something went wrong here in the NOx category. The limit is down here, and it's way up there. So this failed. And the CO2, as we talked about, it's pretty constant stream because it's using pretty much the same amount of fuel, and all the CO2 comes from the fuel. In relation, the tiny concentration of CO doesn't really affect this very much, as you can. So anyway, it failed for NOx pretty heavily. The engine was running too hot for various other reasons. So that's an example of that did get fixed eventually. This was a trip log I did probably the first time, 4 years ago. This is when I was commuting 4.5 miles each day. So nine, most days I just drove to work and back. I believe I went to Western Mass and back, 172 one day. So 11 out of 12 days I drove less than 100 miles, and 9 out of 12 days I drove 10 or less. So you may look at this and say, hey, I could ride a bike most of those low days, and I could, take the bus on that one long day. So it's pretty, if you want to reduce the amount of your impact from your vehicle, taking a look at how you use it is a good start. And this, back a couple of years ago, your typical electric car range, about 100 miles or so. So 11 out of 12 days, 10 out of 12 I could have gotten by cake with an electric car. Up top was a more advanced electric vehicle, which also would have covered my trip. Let's see some cars here. So if you remember, we talked about what can we do to regular vehicles to make them more efficient. This is a 1992 GM Ultralight. This was an exercise in making as efficient of a gasoline vehicle as they possibly could. And they did a pretty good job. Cruising on the highway, it gets 100 miles to the gallon. It's a regular gasoline engine, 3 cylinders, very small. The EPA tested it, got 88 miles per gallon in their combined cycle test. So that's pretty darn good. I believe it has a 5-gallon gas tank. So you could go 500 miles on a trip, and it would only cost you $10 to fill up. I'm not sure about the emission, how the emissions are on this. That I couldn't find out. The car itself, as you can see, uses some pretty advanced shapes. It covers the rear wheels, reduce the drag. It's tapered in the back, pretty low. The actual car itself is a pretty advanced carbon composite. The car weighs 1,400 pounds total. I believe it's about the size of a normal Chevy, maybe smaller than like a Malibu or something. A regular family sedan. Seats 5 adults. And you may, if any of you have seen the movie Demolition Man, back from the 90s with Wesley Snipes and Sylvester Stallone, set in the future of San Angeles. This is the police car. So this was 1992. I've never seen one on the road. I doubt you guys have either.
How fast does it go?
I don't know the top speed. It's probably 100 miles an hour. I don't know. I mean, it's fast enough for any reasonable driving. It's not a race car. A lot of these are not race cars. It's not going to go 200 miles an hour. But with that, it has a 3-cylinder engine. So it's not a gargantuan engine, but the energy load on the vehicle, because it's light and so aerodynamic, is much less. So you could probably it's probably comparable to a regular car. But they don't really like to talk about that vehicle. So you can do some searching on the web though, and the company that designed the actual body has a page on it that talks a little bit about it. This here is the Lareimo LS, which stands for, let's see, Low Resistance Mobile Light and Simple. This was a concept from like a year ago that a German company had. The car weighs only about 900 pounds. And its top speed, 100 miles an hour. I do have information on that. It's a diesel engine. The combustion process is a little more efficient. So by sticking a diesel engine in it, they get a little better mileage. And this car gets 157 miles per gallon. And they're aiming to sell it for $13,000. So I don't know the actual status of it, but this just shows you what you can do with current combustion technology with advanced vehicle technologies. I don't think I know the company might actually be called Lareimo, I'm not sure. It's a 2-seater with this crazy, this is actually the front, that's the door. So it's pretty wild and with a huge hatch. So any of these vehicles you see, if you think, hey, this is kind of neat, go online, you can find other pictures of these, you can find more information about the history than I know or could possibly remember. The Prius here we have featured, this is what it looked like when it came out in Japan in 1997. A few changes for America in 2000 over on the right. A little more power, they changed the rims, they actually changed the bumpers, but basically the same car. They added a little spoiler in the back for reduce the air drag a little bit. They boosted power a little bit, so the mileage was a little worse than the original Japanese version. The original Prius, I believe the mileage was 51 in the city, 45 on the highway. And again, the city is higher than the highway in this setup because it has that crazy combination of all these things going on, and you can actually operate a lot more electrically in the city with this vehicle. And so you get better gas mileage in the city than on the highway, which is the reverse of every other car. The new one gets, oh geez, I believe it's 61 on the highway and 56 or so in the city. So they made it bigger, more powerful, and more efficient. And the emissions on this thing qualifies as an advanced technology super ultra low emission vehicle, which I'll get to, but you have a question.
How much does a car like that cost?
I think this is $20,000. And then they have various packages, but there used to be federal tax credits, but they stopped at 60,000 cars per automaker. And that was in an attempt to, get the domestic automakers who are lagging way behind in these things, that once Toyota sells 60,000 hybrids, the $3,000 tax credit or whatever you got, now it's half that. And then as you sell more, it's even less. So,
Well, there are some in Massachusetts still has credits.
right, so there's state and federal tax credits that you get right off the price. So it is 22, but you could probably chop a few thousand off. But right, not everybody's in the market for a new hybrid. I mean, I can't even afford one. So I can't expect you guys to go out and buy one. Here's some of their newer vehicles. Camry and the Highlander, these have the same setup, but being larger vehicles, heavier. Camry is 40 in the city, 38 on the highway. Highlander is 33 in the city and 28 on the highway. It's less on the highway because as you drive, in a normal car, you're driving up the highway, say you're in cruise control, your engine is actually, that's when in gas cars, it performs its best. It's running at 1 speed, just going straight. In these hybrids, because in this screen here, you'll see that it actually, there's no one mode where you can run from the gas engine straight to the wheels. And so that would be in your parallel setup, which nobody's doing. That would be like 1/2 of the parallel. The problem is when you're driving on the highway, sometimes that gas engine is actually charging the battery, and then the battery's powering the wheels. And so when you go from chemical energy to rotational energy to electrical energy in the battery, and then from the battery electrical to the motor, like you lose a little bit of energy along each of those paths. And so that's probably the main reason why on the highway it's not as good as in the city. Those are Toyotas. Honda, the Honda Insight was the first hybrid sold in America, but not the first hybrid sold. It beat the Prius by just a little bit coming to America. Pretty aerodynamic shape, an aluminum body, 2-seater. That's, I believe it was, 61 and 70? 60 and 66, sorry. And because the Hondas are basically gas engines with electric boost, that's why they have the normal city is lower than the highway. The gas engine always has to be on. Then the first Civic Hybrid on the right, first time any car company actually put a hybrid drive system in a conventional vehicle. They changed a few things, added a spoiler, changed the front, changed the wheels. For the most part, from far away, most people couldn't tell the difference between the hybrid Civic and a regular Civic. And that's 49 and 51, so that's pretty good. Down below, the next generation Civic, very similar setup. And of course, the Honda Accord Hybrid, which is a V6 top of the line Accord, which I believe on the highway gets worse gas mileage than the 4-cylinder manual. Yeah, it's 25 and 34. So Honda really used the hybrid to boost your acceleration, your performance, as opposed to your fuel economy. Quickly a few Honda concepts. The IMAS, the Integrated Motor Alternator Assist or something, I think it stands for, I'm not sure. Sort of looks a lot like the Insight, if you will. And Honda Spocket is a parallel hybrid, I believe. It has electric in the front and gas in the rear. These, of course, are concepts only. Ford finally came out with a hybrid. They licensed the hybrid technology from Toyota. The story, as I understand it, is they went through all the trouble to develop their own hybrid system, and lo and behold, they discovered it was quite similar to Toyota's. So instead of doing all the lawsuits and everything, they decided, well, let's just license it from Toyota. So it's basically the same drive system, but because it's heavier and boxier, a larger engine, it gets 36 in the city and 31 on the highway. For a 2-wheel drive, and the 4-wheel drive gets 33 in the city and 29 on the highway.
It looks huge in that picture, but it's actually a very small SUV
But it's
compared to
right.
what's out there.
It's probably the smallest SUV Ford made up until very recently. But like the Prius I mentioned, it's a super ultra low emission vehicle. And so the way emissions are measured is there's low emission vehicle, ultra low emission vehicle, and super ultra low emission vehicle. And they're just fancy terms for the longer it is, the less pollution it makes. I believe super ultra low is, of those three pollutants we were talking about, the hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, and NOx, it makes, I believe it's 90% less pollution, 90 to 95%, depending on the pollutant, that much less than the average vehicle. So that's significant savings. And because the hybrid gets rid of those polluting sections, those inefficient sections, then you get a lot of emission savings. It shuts the engine off at stoplights. Real quickly, these are some of Toyota's Lexus. Toyota owns a Lexus. That's why these are always grouped together. So there's some of their more fancy vehicles. Something like the GS450H, which I don't think I've ever seen in real life, is basically a performance hybrid. A lot of the Lexus ones are geared towards taking, instead of having a V8 engine, you can have a V6 with a hybrid and get as good or better performance than a V8, for example. But in that market, you know, there's definitely people who can afford a more advanced vehicle. The Nissan Altima hybrid finally came out within the last week or two. This actually licenses Toyota's technology once again. Nissan claims that they are developing their own hybrid system for their next generation. And this has 41 in the city and 36 on the highway. And so it's pretty comparable to the Toyota Camry. Larger than the Prius, you know, same idea as the Camry. Not sure the emission rating on that one. And this, as I was saying, this is one of the examples of a mild hybrid. For example, the regular Saturn Vue in a two-wheel drive version gets 23 in the city and 29 on the highway. The hybrid version gets 27 in the city and 32 on the highway. So 4 better in the city and 3 better on the highway. So 10%, 15%. As I said, this just has high, you know, it's basically a beefed up alternator and starter type system. But it's a step for GM. In the 90s, under the Clinton and Gore administration, there was a program called the Partnership for a New Generation of Vehicles. And this was a government-industry partnership funded partly by both. And the goal was to have the companies develop a full-size family sedan that could achieve 80 miles per gallon and that could be sold by, I believe initially it was 2000, and then maybe it was moved back to 2004. So each of the three domestic automakers, GM, what was Chrysler at the time, and Ford, each had one flagship vehicle to meet this. This is GM's offering. It's called the Precept. As I mentioned, diesel has more energy, diesel fuel. Diesel engines are slightly more efficient. So if you're going just for miles per gallon, well, each one put a diesel engine in their vehicle. This car gets 80 miles to the gallon. It is a parallel hybrid, has electric motor in the front and the diesel engine in the rear. You'll notice that instead of having a grill in the front, it's near the back where the engine is. And that helps achieve that plus its shape helps achieve the lowest coefficient of drag of any vehicle that's ever been made. So this thing really slips through the air. It's has even less drag than GM's fully electric car, which we'll see in a little bit. This is Dodge's offering. It was based off the Dodge Intrepid. The first two are version 2. The last one is version 3. The version 2, you can see again some rear wheel coverings. Both of these had no rear view mirrors. They have little video cameras, which then show what's happening behind you on a little screen. Pretty complicated device just to have a mirror, but does cut down on the air drag around the vehicle. In Chrysler's final offering of this vehicle, they sort of went more towards the mainstream looking car, got rid of the coverings in the back. And I believe, do I have the mileage on this? I think this was in the high 60s maybe. So they didn't quite get to the 80. Ford had their Prodigy, the first two, and then the Futura. This, again, diesel hybrid. The car weighed a total of 2,400 pounds. It used a lot of aluminum. Much lighter than the cars Ford was making at the time and still makes. You may notice this looks a lot like the Ford Fusion, which came out recently. And the first time I saw a commercial for that, I said, hey, I've seen that car before. And believe it or not, Ford is actually claiming that they'll be coming out with a hybrid version of the Fusion. And that rings some bells. I doubt it'll be as cutting edge relatively cutting edge as that one was, but Toyota has a hybrid minivan in Japan. They've been selling it for years. It's much less of a hybrid than their other offerings, but the Estima is a minivan that they don't sell here, but hybrids pretty much take off in Japan. So then just a few concepts. This is Toyota using their hybrid drivetrains for power more so than anything else. The top two are the Volta, nice looking car, extremely fast, I'm sure. This bottom one, the FTHS, That was their most recent offering that they just unveiled at the Detroit Auto Show, I believe, in January. Again, it's a hybrid drivetrain, but everything geared towards power. Except it does have a little hood scoop that says hybrid on it. Ford Model U, the Model T was what got everything started, sort of. Well, so this is the Model U, I guess. It's the combustion engine in the hybrid part of it is actually burns hydrogen instead of gasoline. And so by burning hydrogen, there's no carbon. So you don't get any carbon dioxide, you don't get any unburned hydrocarbons, and you don't get any carbon monoxide. So you just have to deal with the NOx that can result from a high temperature reaction. But you have to get hydrogen from somewhere, which if we have time, we'll talk about. Ford Reflex, another diesel hybrid offered for them. It actually has solar panels on the roof to charge the 12-volt battery, and that supposedly gets 65 miles per gallon.
Do any of these car companies operate on an industrial level greener than others, or are they all pretty much?
I don't know who is greener than who. Toyota, I think in some areas is pretty good. At least they make a big deal about it. I mean, it's hard to cut through a lot of the greenwashing that these companies do. Ford had been doing a lot of stuff. That was sort of their vehicles may have been some of the worst, but at least they were doing a lot of material recycling in their plants. I know the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a nonprofit group, they not only, I think they rate all the vehicles on, the manufacturers on overall who's the greenest vehicle manufacturer based on their cars. No, I'm not sure if they may also take into account the manufacturing. I'm not sure about that. There's a lot of factors: water use, energy use, material use, recycling, everything. So it's a great question. I mean, this extends beyond just the vehicles. So Audi played around with hybrids a little bit. They haven't really been doing much these days. Subaru also has been playing around. That's the turbo parallel hybrid, what they call the B5 TPH. That was a relatively recent prototype, and I think, well, I'll turn this off. So I brought a little prop here, and this is a little radio controlled car that I've had for years, and its sole purpose for the past 4 years has been to be a prop. Yeah, it's still pretty dirty though. You'd think I'd clean it up. So the nice thing about an electric car is it's as simple as this. You have a battery, in this case it's in the floor of the vehicle, which stores the electricity. This is then sent to the motor here in the back or wherever it is in the vehicle. It's sent in a regulated way by a controller. And then that motor turns, sends the motion to a transmission, which powers the wheels, and that's it. There's a lot of pieces of a gasoline vehicle that you just don't need an electric car. So I'll just leave that there for fun. There's no exhaust system. You don't have any of that stuff. There's no radiator. There's no cooling system. You don't need to get oil changes. You don't need to have your coolant flushed. You don't need to get tune-ups. There's very little that can actually go wrong in these vehicles. There's only really one moving part, and that's the electric motor. If you ever open up the hood of a gas vehicle, there's stuff everywhere. So it's pretty complicated. Now, granted, opening the hood of an electric car will still look very complicated, but in essence, this is what it is. I think that clock is right on the computer, right? Oh.
Oh, sorry. I just have a
No.
question.
Great.
How long can an electric car go on a charge?
Great question. Because an electric motor is so efficient, even if you create the electricity from a fossil fuel hundreds of miles away, you actually get significantly better well-to-wheel efficiency, about 3 times, give or take, for a comparable car. And if you could charge it off renewable sources, whether it be on your house or at a central solar station, then that's even better, much less pollution. Now, the question is that you bring up about range is one of the reasons why we don't have these vehicles right now. They have a limited range, of course. If you remember that chart, I had mentioned that about 100 miles was a pretty standard for electric cars of the day. And depends on the battery type. Some of them use the same batteries as 100 years ago, because electric cars were around 100 years ago when electric, steam, and gas were all vying for the new automobile market. Ironically, the electric starter motor may have been what caused the gas cars to win out. But the electric cars were, people liked them because they were, back then, they were quiet. They were clean, they didn't spew all this pollution. You didn't have to crank them to get them started, you just basically push the button. They towed the gas cars home when the gas cars broke down. But they still had range issues then. And sort of along the same lines as the range, there's also a range and a charging time issue. If you have a short range, but if you can charge quickly, that may offset some of it. Well, most electric cars charge overnight. So it takes 6 to 8 hours if the battery is completely dead to then charge it all the way back up. Now, there are chargers that can actually, instead of doing it slowly in 6 to 8 hours, can do it in 10 to 15 minutes. And there's been a lot of development lately, more advanced batteries, more advanced charging. And there are some pretty promising prospects. And so why don't I just get to some of these, and I can talk about that as I show them. So here you had asked about plugging in hybrids. None of the major auto manufacturers sell a plug-in hybrid. A few say they're developing them. A few won't say whether they're developing them. But then there's a few companies that said, you know what? You guys are too slow. We're just going to do this ourselves. And so there's a few companies that you buy a Prius, take it to them, they'll convert it to a plug-in. They put a bigger battery in the back. You can plug it in at home. They add in some more electronics. And for $10,000 more on top of the price of your $22,000 brand new car, you can void your warranty and get a plug-in hybrid. But with this battery, this is a pretty advanced lithium-ion battery, can store a lot of energy for the amount of weight. The original batteries in electric cars 100 years ago, and even then again 10 or 15 years ago, were lead acid. Lead is really heavy. So it's the amount of energy you can store versus how much it weighs. But this, they like to claim you can get 100 miles per gallon in this, but that doesn't take into account the electricity you put into the battery. So they're just measuring it. The Prius sees the car as getting 100 miles per gallon. And that means when you unplug from the wall, you drive all electric for a while. And then eventually it turns into a normal Prius. When you see them say, oh, plug-in conversion 100 miles per gallon, they're not adding in the energy from the wall. Of course, the electric part is much more efficient, but that's still one thing to keep in mind. Chevrolet recently introduced the Volt. This is finally their plug-in series hybrid. So remember I was saying I was parallel and series and nobody's doing either? Well, this is actually a series hybrid. A generator, an engine, and all it does is power a generator, and that generator charges the batteries, which drive basically an electric car. This car is a prototype only. This is probably the only one that exists. I don't know if it even runs. It supposedly has a 40-mile range as an electric car, and then can go another 600 miles in its hybrid mode. And I have a very quick intro to an article that I'm going to read regarding prototypes. It's from Home Power. It's a pretty old article. I just happened to stumble upon it. So it says, first we need to understand a little bit about press releases from automakers. There are 5 levels of reality in them. The least real is the future technology press release. These are projects the company's working on and hoping to bring to fruition sometime in the indefinite future, maybe. A sure sign is the lack of any photo of an actual car. Second level is the concept car. These can be deceiving. You see a beautiful shiny car at an auto show, Exhibit A, or in a magazine, and a complete list of features. It's real because you're seeing it, right? Wrong. This is a one-off car the companies build just to demonstrate the nifty things they could do. Remember those PNGV hybrids from the 90s. It bears no more resemblance to production cars than those bizarre outfits on fashion show runways resemble off-the-rack clothes. The third level is the prototype. This is similar to the concept car, but the manufacturer is seriously thinking about putting it into production. The fourth level is the test vehicle. In this case, they make a limited number, and then often test vehicles are not released to the public, although they may be leased to vehicle fleets. And the fifth level is production. This is when you can actually go to a dealer, sign the papers, hand over the money, and drive away in one of your very own. So keep that in mind. This would probably fall into the prototype category. GM says, this is great, we're going to do this when a battery is developed, which is basically them hunting, because there are actually battery technologies today, as proven by other hybrid offerings, that could make maybe not as stellar a vehicle as what they want, but you could at least get the ball rolling. So anyway, on to the electrics. Here's an electric car from the 1900s from Phoenix. You know, there are some of these still kicking around. I think Mike Kittredge might actually have one of these in the Auto Museum of Yankee Candle. Here's that Honda EV Plus. This is a all-electric vehicle, got about 80 to 100 miles. Same type of battery in the Honda hybrids. They still have an EV, they still mention this car on their website, but they mention it in passing as a step to their hybrid as opposed to the hybrids being a step to this vehicle. This vehicle also has a brief cameo, I believe, in the movie. Mercedes-Benz also played around with the A-Class as a car, only available in Germany and Europe. They don't sell it over here. But as you can see, they have one large battery, which sits underneath the floor, very similar to my remote control car. You know, you can still see it looks pretty complicated, but basically battery, motor, transmission, and a controller. That then formed the basis of their fuel cell program, this car. Here's the RAV4. Actually, I didn't realize there's not very many of these left. I saw one of these a year ago when I was in California, and had I known how few there were left, I probably would have run after the guy and stopped him and asked if I could get a ride or something. But anyway, again, battery is under the floor. Same type of battery as in their hybrids. Here you can see it's pretty simple, you know, battery, your electronics, and motor and transmission, and that's it. This car got about 100-mile range. There's still a handful of these around, probably less than 100, I'm not sure. They were leased in the late 90s, this as well as the Honda EV Plus and a few others. When the California regulations got changed, those leases were terminated, or they were allowed to, you know, when they ended, companies took the cars back. Toyota actually allowed people to buy these vehicles. There are still people driving these today. The batteries are, you know, some of these cars have, just reading, I think somebody has, you know, at least 5 years of use on these batteries, still as good as the day they got them. So it's a pretty good testament to how well they made this vehicle and how it was actually, the worries about battery life didn't pan out. Nissan had this is more of in the prototype stage, and this had lithium-ion batteries, which was pretty new back in the 1990s. Steel body, though, the car was really heavy, but it still got over 100-mile range. Here's GM's EV1, which is the focus of the Who Killed the Electric Car movie. They made a few versions. This has even though it's pretty aerodynamic, that GM hybrid, the Precept, actually beats it by just a little bit. But this is the next most aerodynamic car ever produced. This was leased in limited numbers. People who drove them loved them. And not to ruin anything, but they, GM also made S10 pickup trucks, which were very useful for fleets, universities. They had central charging stations. You can see a bunch of them lined up here. You know, those low range, low speed applications were perfect for the electric vehicles. Low maintenance costs. GM also used their body to do a bunch of other prototypes, a parallel hybrid, a natural gas, even a fuel cell vehicle off that. But then, of course, they recalled the vehicles, put them behind barbed wire. Chrysler minivan, basically a Dodge Caravan, in the 60s or 70-mile range, I'm not exactly sure. Ford Ranger, basically the same as their regular Ranger, but electric. Selectria has actually eventually worked at this company for a little bit, but I was not. This was after they made this car. This is called the Selectria Sunrise. These are a few different versions. The one on the upper right has the world record for the longest trip on a charge for an electric vehicle of 373 miles. And the blue one, I believe, gets a real world range of about 200. So that's like actual driving, not just babying it to try to get the world record. It's a pretty advanced body. The body is two pieces. It was made by hand at least I think it was made by hand, some type of fiberglass advanced composite. And here you can see the crash test. I don't know what the results were, but they did have to crash one of their nice expensive vehicles to prove that their computer simulations of this material were actually accurate, and I believe that it went well. I think they were hoping to sort of market this and get an automaker to team up with them or something. Didn't quite work out, so Volkswagen played around a little bit. They worked with a company in California to make some of the more recent vehicles. This is one of their older ones called the City Stromer, the one at the top, the old Golf. So there's a lot of tinkering around. Not many vehicles have been for sale, though. Pivco was a company that was later bought by Think in order to meet part of their requirement in California. First version is in the upper left. I don't think that the convertible version really was, I think that was more of a prototype. But the ones at the bottom actually did get leased, and now a company has actually, I believe those cars, a lot of those were saved. They were not destroyed. They were sent back overseas or something. I'm not exactly sure, back to Norway, which is where Pivco's from. The new company has actually invested in it and is planning on developing the vehicle again. Here's just a handful of others. Another sports car called the Zebra. I don't know where that is these days. T0 beats a Ferrari in a drag race every time. Another few others, a school bus, delivery van, an 8-passenger limousine. There's actually a newer version of that which looks even better. Volvo, lithium-ion electric car, 180-mile range. They did this quite a few years ago. Not much was heard, and then I just saw a picture of it actually at the auto show this year. So it's interesting that they seem to have brought it back. It's a 3-passenger arrangement, 2 in the front, 1 behind. Try to get more tapered aerodynamics. Mitsubishi's done some work. They haven't made anything available, but they've obviously gone through a lot of different vehicles. The Colt, the Lancer, which is the same as the Lancer that you see around, but an electric version. All theirs use advanced lithium-ion batteries. The bottom left is actually a concept hybrid. So all of these are really in the sort of the prototype stages. This is just a quick rundown of Mitsubishi. It's looking at putting the motors in the wheels. So you don't even need a transmission. So this is one other approach to get another component out of the vehicle. And so they see that sort of architecture. They can make it a hybrid, they can make it electric, they can make it fuel cell, and this is an approach that a lot have been taking. If anyone's seen Minority Report, the Lexus that's in that movie is actually an electric car. They don't mention it, nobody really talks about it, and obviously a one-off prototype, but it's an electric car, supposedly. I've seen it in person at a car show, but you couldn't actually look inside it. So this is sadly what's happened to the EV1. They were collected in a trailer from that parking lot, and although they claim they would recycle all the parts, the body of it's actually made out of the same thing as soda bottles, the body panels, the non-structural parts, which you can easily recycle, but as you can see, they're stacked up in the desert. A company called Tesla Motors. Their first car is the Roadster, 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, 135 mile per gallon equivalent, so they do the comparison of generating the electricity and figure that all out. 250-mile range, probably more like 200 if you drive like an average person. Lithium-ion batteries. So here they're really pushing for, and the body is a lightweight aluminum frame, carbon composite body. They're obviously going more towards the high-end market, people who are willing to afford, who are looking for a fast car anyway, who are going to spend that much on a car. This car costs $100,000, by the way, and they're really looking at a vehicle that can compete with Porsches and whatnot. Venturi is a French company, sort of the same idea as the Tesla Roadster. They have what's the Venturi Fetish. Again, another high-performance 2-seater Roadster sports car. This costs $300,000, or 300,000 euros. Again, a pretty select market. I believe they're built to order. One of the things these companies are trying to sort of distill the image of, electric cars are not slow golf carts. Like, you can actually, an electric motor is a very powerful propulsion device. It's what powers all of the locomotives. Even the diesel ones, the diesel locomotives are hybrids. They provide the torque to get those locomotives going, and the same thing applies in a car. AC Propulsion made conversions of the Scion XB. On top of an $18,000 XB, or however much it costs, you pay $55,000 more. You can convert it to a lithium-ion powered XB called the E-Box. Gets 140 to 180 mile range, which is pretty good for a boxy vehicle like that. Phoenix Motor Cars, yet another California company. They're going towards the sport utility truck, and believe it or not, even though it's a truck, this still gets over 100-mile range. Uses a pretty advanced one type of lithium-ion battery, and they're hoping to sell these sometime soon. I think their target price is a little more reasonable. Oh no, I don't know the price on that. This car is only $70,000, and this car gets 150-mile range with nickel zinc batteries, which not many people use these days, or a 300-mile range with lithium-ion. Again, not quite production stage, but supposedly they'll be selling them in summer 2007. Some of these companies, are fairly small operations, and so, who knows what will happen to them. But it's exciting that they're doing this. So real quick, this is about almost 10 years ago, my dad and I converted a regular old 1986 Volkswagen Jetta. We gutted out everything and made it an electric car. We have some pretty large batteries, the lead acid batteries, old technology, heavy. This car only gets about 35, 40 miles range. Perfect for around town though, low speed. Car probably can only go about 60, 65, just because the motor is not sized to provide any more power than that. But it's a little bit heavier than the car used to be. These batteries are very heavy, but in terms of how much one could, getting those lithium iron nickel metal batteries is expensive. I believe the nickel metal batteries for that Toyota RAV4 cost more than they were selling the car for. The car they're selling for $40,000, and the batteries cost more than that. But as more batteries get developed, the price will come down more and more, and it's a question of how much, how fast, and whatnot. So underneath that pack, there is, on the right is the regular transmission from the Volkswagen, the standard transmission. And then the motor is about 9 inches in diameter, has a little adapter and mates right up to that transmission. There's 9 more batteries in the trunk. There are 7 up front, 9 in the back, so 16 total. Just enough room in the back to put your groceries in there. So you still have some trunk space left. But just seeing that you only get about 35, 40 miles a day when that pack is fully charged sort of gives you an idea of how much energy is in a gallon of gasoline. I mean, this Jetta as a gasoline vehicle probably got, maybe in the 30s, I'm not exactly sure, on the highway. Around town it probably got mid-20s, high 20s. So this can provide a little bit more than what 1 gallon of gasoline can provide, all those batteries. So real quick, you charge it by plugging it in what used to be the gas filler. There's no tailpipe, so there's a nice little hole in the back. And if money were no object, probably just go out and buy one of the other ones. But yeah, lithium battery, there's a few things that matter in terms of like matching the battery voltage, has to match sort of the components you have. And then you have to get a charger that can charge those types of batteries and can feed the power to it in the right, there's a certain, you charge it this much for so long and then do this and monitor. So you need a new charger, and you may have to change a few things, but you could almost swap in. And my dad's he's been wanting to move to something other than lead acid, just because it's so heavy. And every month or so you have to add a little bit of distilled water to the batteries. And that's really the only maintenance. But you could get a much better range if you could, it's 1,000 pounds of batteries. So if you get the same amount of power in half the weight, which is like what a nickel metal hydride battery could provide, you get, you'd add substantially to your range. So we talked a lot about the cars themselves, but that's only one of sort of its 4 stages of life. And the first is it has to be manufactured. So all the components have to be made, whether it's a gas car, electric car, whatever, you have to mine all the materials, you have to transport them, then you have to process them, then you have to transport them against, water. You have to use a lot of water, all the paint, all the chemicals. And the batteries, I don't know the specifics. They're pretty, there's a lot of precious metals. Well, I don't know if they're technically considered precious metals, but we have nickel, there's lithium, there's a lot of metals that are not cheap that are getting put into these things. And I don't know how environmentally sensitive the process is of manufacturing those components. Yeah. I do know that lithium is it is non-toxic, so you could really throw the lithium away, and it shouldn't cause any problems. Lead, for example, you need to recycle the lead, and I think 98% of lead batteries are recuperated, so it's probably the most recycled substance there is. But those you don't want to just throw out because lead causes all sorts of problems. Lithium, I believe, is benign, but you would still want to recycle that because when it's reached the end of its life, you still want to use that lithium again and to make another battery. But as for the specifics of the different manufacturing processes, I don't know the details. But it's obviously something to keep in mind because you want to look at what we do today in terms of manufacturing and clean that up, but also say if we're going to move to a new technology, we have to make sure that doesn't cause problems. It may be cleaner when it's used. Let's make sure it's also not damaging when we create it.